Well, hello again, and welcome to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. We're doing another live event today, and I'm really excited to have you joining us. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and the Alliance. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. We started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint to raise awareness about the use of restraint and seclusion initially in schools across the nation, but really we're very concerned about the use of restraint and seclusion anywhere that they're happening. Our mission is to help educate the public and connect people together who are interested in dedicated in changing minds, laws, policies, and practices so that we can reduce and eliminate interventions like restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, all the things that we're doing to kids rather than working with them successfully. Our vision is to see safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. And to that end, I'm really excited today to have another fantastic guest with us. Teresa Olafson is joining us today for a very special presentation. She's going to be talking about school resource officers, first do no harm. We'll be taking your questions today during the presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them at any time. And I will be looking out for those questions and bring those up on the screen as we get them. Also want to let you know that today's event is being recorded, as we always do. It's right now streaming live to YouTube and Facebook, but we also record it and make it available on Facebook, YouTube, and as an audio podcast. So always exciting to have that available after the fact. So let me begin by introducing our special guest today. We have Teresa with us, and really excited to have Teresa here. Teresa has been blessed with two amazing sons. And as she says, they have raised her to be a fierce advocate. A lot of us don't enter into advocacy by plan or by choice, but we rise to the call when it's necessary. And Teresa is somebody that's definitely kind of risen to that need as an advocate. She's working now on her master's degree in nursing administration and management. And it's actually, we had a great conversation the other day, looking into areas like neurobiology and trauma, and really trying to learn and contribute more to help make our schools and beyond much better. She says that she's newer to advocacy, but I think that we could probably get rid of that label at this point. She's very passionate about empowering families and creating positive impact on educational, healthcare, and political systems, really through shared knowledge of bringing people together. And I know you, Teresa, as I introduce you here, I know you also recently had the opportunity to present on this topic at the COPA conference. So I'm sure that was a great experience as well. So welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for a wonderful introduction. This is very humbling, and it is such an honor to be here. So I appreciate the time and the platform. Thank you so much, Guy. You've
Absolutely.
been an inspiration, just a mentor that I was trying to remember how we actually connected. It's been a while since we first initially connected with one another. So
yeah, absolutely. And I remember connecting and talking to you and Victoria Johnson as well, who's been on this program about what was going on in North Dakota. And, it really takes that kind of connection. I mean, ultimately, we hope to see people across 50 states that are taking action and doing things to help to, prohibit these practices. We already had some comments here. Somebody said, why are restraints still allowed in some states? And sadly, they're allowed in most states. In fact, corporal punishment is still allowed in many states. 19 states allow corporal punishment. So we've got a lot of work to do to get some of these practices changed. Really excited to have you here talking today. You wrote an article for us a while back about, kind of police in schools, and I think have done some really amazing research in that area. So excited to have you talking about kind of what you've learned and sharing with us. So I am going to bring up your presentation on the screen. And as soon as I do, okay, so we've got your presentation on the screen. I know that you are seeing your presentation, no longer seeing me, but you can now take it away. And as we get questions, I will try to bring those to your attention. So I would encourage people that are watching, feel free to, ask questions or make comments, and we'll try to look for opportunities to get to those.
Yes, absolutely. So the presentation obviously is School Resource Officers First Do No Harm. And as Guy had introduced, we actually have presented at the COPA parent presentation way back in March. So that is our first slide. So let me introduce myself. In addition to what Guy gave, very humbling introduction. My name is Teresa Olafson. I am a parent first and foremost. It's been an amazing role that has come with a little bit of bumps and bruises along the way, but it has been such a great experience for me as a parent. I'm also a nurse, which has kind of given me the foundation to be an advocate. I call myself an advocate, and I kind of wince when I say that because I don't think of myself within the same leagues as some advocates that are out there. I think I'm still learning. It's a big learning curve as well. I come from Fargo, North Dakota. I am born and raised in North Dakota. I moved to Fargo. I won't say how many years ago, but it's been a lot. Fargo actually is the most populated city of our state. But our school district itself is actually only the second largest of the state, but we do serve over 11,000 students. It's interesting because North Dakota is very, very Caucasian based. We're very white up here, about 86% of us. We do have a larger Native American population, but we have very few people of color that live in North Dakota. And that's just a really good reference as we move on about why am I from Fargo, North Dakota, talking to you guys about SROs. It's really interesting to know that SROs, the school resource officers, have actually been in our schools since about 1950. They were first placed into the Flint, Michigan school district. And their role was actually as a resource to keep our students and our schools safe. So ever since their introduction into that role, we've noticed that there has been a mission creep from the original intent of keeping schools and students safe. And it's just kind of has exaggerated from there to kind of be more reflective of what we're actually seeing now out into society, has actually become reflective of what the SROs are seeing, maybe seeing in the cultural safety of our schools. The National Association of School Resource Officers, or NASRO, define SROs as those that are career law enforcement officers that have the sworn authority that are placed into school settings. So this may explain, though, why those deviant societal behaviors quickly become missions for SROs that they identify and address in our schools, because that's what police are trained to do. So what once was a consistent role of ensuring like those safe school environments now may actually be a main contributor to the growing disparity of both the school discipline and the justice practices against specific population of students that we know that we recognize that are ethnic or race, gender or disability statuses. And that's what ACLU has pointed out in several reports. For me, as I looked into the SRO roles within our schools, it's really hard not to see that there's the influence of money. So the U.S. Department of Justice has a community-oriented police services. It's actually called COPS. And this is a federally funded program that sets the foundation for SROs in our public schools. In 2018, the COPS budget was noted at $218 million. That gained an extra $45 million after the Sandy Hook shooting. After the Parkland shooting, another $1 billion was given to states to infuse into their security budget. But what was interesting was a line majority was noted to go to SRO programs. Public school budgets, their constraints typically do not extend into what is considered the health and safety budgets, or basically what the SROs are funded by. So when we see those mental health tragedies that occur, such as the Parkland shooting that happened in Florida, our nation responds unilaterally with a bipartisan support, such as like the $70 billion military budget. Yet then on the same side, We go ahead and cut our educational budget, which includes funds for things like the School Safety National Activities Program. And that was cut for about $25 million over 2 years. However, this program was very instrumental in implementing behavioral health best practices within our public schools. And that goes to our students that are in need. So it really doesn't make sense while we're funneling money into militarizing our SROs in schools, yet removing funding sources for kids with mental health needs in our schools. Another part of the funding issue is our Title IX Part A funds that go into improving the educational safety and health needs for our students. That's what they're earmarked for, those dollars. Can also be applied across many different categories that the school districts consider to either be health or safety, which means these dollars can also be funneled into SRO programs. You're going to hear me reference several times the ACLU 2019 Cops and No Counselors, How the Lack of School Mental Health Staff is Harming Students reports. If you've never been out to the ACLU website, they have many different reports that they have produced over the last several years, in particular about how our public schools are impacted by having cops and officers there. These numbers are pretty staggering and they're pretty eye-opening, and hopefully for a lot of us, they're pretty familiar to us too. So the data is pretty simple that we have 1.7 million students that go to school with a cop but no counselor. 3 million students are in schools with cops but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with a cop but no school psychologist. 10 million students go to school with cops, but absolutely no social workers. For me, those are some pretty staggering numbers. This is one of my favorite quotes by Linda Reinstein. She's a mesothelioma widow. And I love it because I think it is what represents the issue that we have with SROs pretty unilaterally, no matter where you are in our country, is without responsibility and accountability and transparency, no one is safe. So I worked with Victoria Johnson, and the Alliance had her on a handful of weeks ago with her inspirational story of developing her advocacy group in our state of North Dakota. And I worked with another mom, Nikki Kerr, and we developed this article report that we presented to our congressmen. And what we tried to learn about is who actually has oversight of SROs, whether it's local, whether it's state, whether it's federal. We were very concerned because we realized after George Floyd's incident that if there was going to be police reform, that we wanted to have input into ensuring that the SRO's roles was also included in any type of reform. And we just kind of wanted to understand who had oversight, who was actually going to have input into any type of role revitalizing roles, or how these changes were going to occur. And what we found is at a federal level, there's no national standard on SROs. So then we went to go look at our state of North Dakota and any states at all. And then we just kind of started to notice a trend. And it became very concerning to us as parents that we couldn't find any clear accountability of who was responsible for SROs when they're in our schools. So President Obama's administration had a lot of focus on putting SROs into our schools, but as a mechanism of creating school safety to address the physical safety of students from outside harms or threats. But in conjunction with that, there was also the enforcement and preservation of the disparity groups of students for their civil rights. So there was a balance. What had happened, though, is when Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos was appointed into her position, we had noticed, not we, society, oversight groups had noticed that there had seemed to be a lagging enforcement and sometimes a removal of these civil rights for students. So a trend emerged where concerns of entanglement of the policing power were noted, especially with the internal school disciplinary procedures in addressing how schools were responding to students' either developmentally appropriate behaviors or disability presented behaviors within the education environment. So SROs who are entrusted to oversee the student bodies were responding within a policing manner, but not necessarily maybe a school staff manner when engaging students who were in distress and were responding in a behavioral response. So without even a national standardization, what happens is it defaults to the states to establish rules or even all the way down to the local educational agencies to develop and adhere to what we learned are memorandums of understandings. And these memorandums of understandings are supposed to outline or give some clarity to how the SROs are to expedite their role and be responsible. In particular, when addressing student behaviors. But what happens is, since there's no national standard that establishes SRO qualifications or training, and only a few states have actually established their own, that means about 24% of all states mandate any type of working knowledge of juvenile justice training. So we really have SROs that are in our schools that literally have no training or education on how to deal with juvenile behaviors or that have any idea of juvenile justice or related issues. My state in North Dakota, what we discovered when we researched this is we have no state laws for oversight on school enforcement units, on how officers are trained to interact with students. I think what we were really disappointed to learn is that our schools or our districts are held to the simple expectation, just an expectation of a choice to follow the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And within that, there is a description of what a law enforcement unit can be like in a school environment. And that's just a simple expectation that a school may or may not adhere to the Family Education Right and Privacy Act. Or if we're lucky enough, there may or may not be a memorandum of understanding, which may or may not exist, which may or may not be our right to access. So that was quite a rude awakening to know that there is little to no oversight or guidance for SROs in our state, much less at a federal level.
Hey, Teresa, can I pop in with a quick question for you?
Yes.
Thinking about what you said about the MOU or what might be providing oversight, how might someone that is interested in what things look like in their district, might they go about requesting a copy of the MOU?
So you can request a copy of the MOU. Well, you could just request it as a citizen, making outreach. Hey, I would like to go to the superintendent and request and see if there one exists. Or you can do a Freedom of Information Act request, which compels them to give you a copy of the MOU.
Now, how did you get a copy of the MOU for your uh, district?
Actually, Victoria Johnson, who you had on
Hmm.
previously, was able to get that, and it was just a simple request. She did
Gotcha,
not
gotcha.
need to ask for it through a Freedom of Information Act.
So like many things, maybe starting off with the path of
Yeah,
least resistance, and then if you need to, escalate it to a FOIA
right,
type request. Okay, great. Yeah,
right.
I just wanted to ask that question because I'm sure people that are watching that might want to know, what are the guidance that's being offered for their districts?
Right, and that's a really good question because shouldn't we all want to know who's responsible, how they're responsible, and what parts that are playing into our kids' daily lives? And I think if I was the SRO, and I'm not, I'm not an officer, but I think I would like to know as well what my role and responsibility to these kids that are entrusted to me, that I am, charged with protecting too. Like, what are my roles and responsibilities are?
Mhm, mhm.
I think that's a bi-directional communication too. So I would hope that they would be asking as well, and perhaps not relying so much on what their training is, but what they're actually held accountable to that is written down.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. Okay, I'll step aside again. I just wanted to ask that
No,
'cause
you're
I think it's
good.
a good question. Okay.
Good. So unlike the other two moms that I worked with to develop this presentation, My 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 son did not have an encounter with an SRO. We had heard different families within the state of North Dakota, and each parent, Nikki and Victoria, their own child had their own encounters. But for me, being a nurse, I'm very proactive. I'm very big picture thinking. So my intent was different. What I realized is my child had been in the North Dakota public education system since the age of 3. We entered early interventions at the age of 2.5. I was very well aware that prior to 2019, two things happened to a child in the state of North Dakota. Once they reach the age of 7, first thing is they're compelled to go to school. So once you're 7, you have to go to school in the state of North Dakota. Once you reached the age of 7, prior to 2019, you also reached the age of criminal responsibility. Those two things were very concerning to me as a mom with a child who had a stress response. And the stress response obviously was very concerning for meltdowns. In the public schools, we label meltdowns as aggression or assault or even worse things. We always put on those negative connotations. One thing in the state of North Dakota in 2019 that happened was our then Governor Doug Burgum signed House Bill 1039 that changed that criminal culpability age to 10. But we kept the Uniform Juvenile Court Act, in which defines an unruly or a delinquent child who could still be charged with a criminal act by the juvenile justice system. So for me as a parent, there was little comfort in delaying the reality by just a couple of years in the state of North Dakota. And that reality hits home when you have a child that is Native American, that is Black, or that is disabled. So my story for my son is in North Dakota, aversion interventions were already being used for his disability related behavior by the age of 4, which of course escalated his response to assertive adults during times of his stress. I firmly believe our story is very much North Dakota's initiation into the school to prison pipeline. So I am very determined to prevent not just my child, but all of the children from this almost certain fate of where we start funneling kids into the school to prison pipeline. At the age of 4, I could not believe this. So the culture in North Dakota exists very heavily on command and compliance. Our society, our communities, our families, it is especially prevalent in our education buildings, in our ideologies. It's very pervasive. It influences how we see students, especially those that are stressed out in a non-adaptive education environment. We pretty much, if a child cannot be compliant to a command, containment results. And that's the best way that I have learned to describe it. We contain that child, whether it's through restraints, whether it's through containment into a room by themselves, so isolation, seclusion, whether we call it a timeout. We make sure that child is contained and removed. So ACLU's 2019 had a report out that said North Dakota had a 67% increase of school arrests or referrals, which is above the national average. In the North Dakota penal system, what I discovered is the average male in our jail system in North Dakota reads at a 2nd grade level. A female reads a little bit better at a 4th grade level. So when we collectively wrote this report to present to our congressmen, and it was last summer, my motivation for change comes from having an illiterate child in 3rd grade in North Dakota, knowing that his future, realizing his future in North Dakota is not going to be spent playing on monkey bars, but his reality is he will be behind prison bars if I do not help make change come to North Dakota. So these are just some caveats of North Dakota from our juvenile court 2019 annual report. It's really unfortunate that for some reason, and I'm sure this is reflective of any state, that we have what is pretty much considered age-based offenses. That means if you're under the age of 18, you are charged with these things just because you're under the age of 18. An unruly act is you're truant, you're not going to school, or you're going to run away, and run away could be from home or from school. Ungovernable behavior, that's one that I personally take offense to, because if ungovernable behavior is resulting in this school, I call that non-modified school environment that causes an ungovernable behavior. We're not doing something right at school that causes the child to be stressed out, and we're not adapting to their needs. But here in North Dakota, we're calling that ungovernable behavior.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because, when we see a child being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled,
Yeah.
so often the root of it is a child that's not having their needs appropriately met. Yet the perception is far different from that.
It's, I probably will die on that hill, as many parents and advocates and professionals will, because when you live it every day, you can totally express through science and statistics and in every way, whether it's personal or through a detached explanation. But people only see what they want to see and what they want to label. And, it just comes down to what people are willing to be accountable and responsible for. And if we can remove accountability and responsibility for it, I think that's why we tend to say ungovernable behavior. I just makes me sad to see how much responsibility is transferred on to children who are developing life skills or are challenged because of their disabilities or lagging skills that they haven't had the support to develop. Yeah, it makes me sad.
And often may not even have the skills necessary to meet the demands that are being placed on them.
Exactly. Non-adapted environments,
Right.
Universal design. I'm all for universal design if we understand exactly what that means for people of all abilities. So in North Dakota, I have argued this with a few from the legal system, is why we have on our century code that a deprived child is one without a proper parent care, but yet we don't see this bidirectional as coming from the school system either, because proper parent care, or it should be reflected, any adult who has responsibility over the child too. So if there is not proper care that's being performed in the school or at a daycare center, or whatever the caveat might be, we should be able to expand that and not just assume that it's the proper that or parent that is not giving the proper care either. So case in point, I think a lot of times when we have a child that is ruled ungovernable behavior at school, that we should be looking to see what is depriving the child at school. But I wasn't successful with that argument. Maybe somebody else out there would be more successful, but it just seems like we don't have a lot of accountability for what the adults are doing at school, or maybe not doing at school, that would allow for better results of that child to be able to have more emotional control. So what was interesting for me is, and Victoria is actually the one who pointed me in the direction of finding the OJJDP report. They had come in to the state of North Dakota and said, you guys seem to have a higher than average arrest rate for your youth. When we look at the numbers, we have concern about your disproportionate minority contact, because you guys are kind of a white state. And we noticed that in Burleigh, Cass, Grand Forks, and Ward counties, which hold the most of your minority youth, there's some very concerning ratios that we're discovering. You can see the ratios for yourselves, and these were data points that were taken in 2017. But my county, which is Cass County, if you're a Black youth, you are pretty much assured that if you have an encounter with an officer, whether it's an SRO or an officer in the community, 71% of the arrests are made of a Black youth. Burleigh County, which holds our capital of Bismarck, if you are an American Indian, 80% of the youths are American Indians. So you can see that we definitely have a disproportionate minority contact. So what they did is they asked the stakeholders to come together and devise a plan to start reducing these contacts. And they came together and said that, well, with some learning literacy and some diversion programs, that we think that we can effectively reduce these percentage rates by about 2% the following year. Which I don't think that's a lofty enough goal. And I think if in 2019, 2020, that you're just discovering learning literacy to educate yourself, we're really behind the ball in North Dakota. That's just my opinion. But our referrals into the justice system here in North Dakota doesn't just primarily come from arrest. It's also coming from our social service system and the school. So we have several areas that we can see improvement with these rates that we just need to collectively work on through all systems for improvement. I think one of the things that we tend to forget about is that school encompasses a greater context than that of just like simple learning. It's an environment where actually most of the accomplished developmental tasks that a child attains, or sometimes they don't attain, um, occurs during the time that they're at school. And this impacts their future lifelong accomplishments pretty much in all of the arenas of their life. So these are the most important times in our kids' life. So the US public education is actually really challenged. I think we all can agree to meet what is noted as some very rapid rising mental health needs. And I listed a lot of the needs. As Guy had introduced, one of my things that I'm really professionally motivated to address are adverse childhood experiences, which actually sets up a lot of neuropsychology of the depression, suicidality, and anxiety that little kids grow into as adolescents or even into adulthood. Yeah, that's my passion. My passion is for change. We know that there's a lagging ratio of school-based mental health providers. We know this ACLU has shown us the numbers. It's vital, I think, though, for all of us to recognize that students are 21 times more likely to engage school staff for their mental health needs than to go outside and seek that engagement from a community source. And I think that speaks very highly that not we, but our students still see that the school environment is very nurturing. So what are the challenges that are facing our students? And this is just coming straight again from that ACLU 2019 Cops and No Counselors. And these are pretty staggering statistics. I don't think anybody would disagree. Within just a 10-year, just one decade, from 2006 to 2016, we've seen a 70% increase in suicide rates for kids 10 to 17 years old. That's pretty staggering. Every time we have a school shooting, we know that there are direct and indirect adverse childhood experiences occurring. We know that 35 million children have been exposed to an event that goes on to lead to childhood trauma. Mental health episode typically is experienced in adolescence, which means for those who are mental health providers, is most effectively treated during adolescence as well. 1 in 5 youths affected by a mental health issue will then lead to a diagnosis during those youth years. 1 in 10 youths will require additional mental health support in the school setting. And mental health concerns directly impact academic achievements and contribute up to 50% of the school dropout rates. For our North Dakota Systemic Process Improvement Plan, we had picked in improving the graduation rates for those who are on an IEP with the category of emotional disturbance. And I believe I've been following that trend. I know that's hard for you all to believe at this point in time that I'd be following trends like that. But I have, and we really have not budged on that goal. It's a 5-year plan, and I don't think that we have made much of an improvement on that goal in 5 years. So I think that's really a sad state that we can't even achieve one simple goal that we've set as a state. So for this report, I simply picked a few resources to reference, and Ryan and his co-authors were one of them. He had a very interesting statistic that he took from the National Center of Education Statistics, where 41% of public school teachers reported that student behaviors disrupted their ability to teach. It's pretty interesting. 43% of public school teachers also self-reported that they lacked the behavioral management training provided by their education. I find that very interesting. I find that highly correlating too. So this leads us to ask, as we know that there's not a lot of resources in our school buildings, but we do know we have a lot of SROs in our school buildings. So public schools are struggling to support the mental and behavioral health needs of students, which actually allows us to have an over-reliance on policing the student behaviors. And we know why. Struggling teachers have better access to coordinate or to seek interventions by an SRO than the ability to have a mental health provider in the school to address those behavioral concerns that the students are displaying. Being asked to manage student behaviors without an adequate role definition or to have any type of mandated training. Remember when we talked about SROs, how they get trained, if anybody's watching what they're doing. So without any of that as their foundation, SROs unilaterally go to what they're trained to do, which is to police. And you gain control over behaviors by policing or having hands-on tactics. So what is known through aversion interventions, whether it's by the school officials or whether it's by the SROs themselves, a student education is affected. And we know that it contributes up to about 50% of the school dropout rates is by having SROs involved. So I keep mentioning school-based mental health providers or mental health providers in the school. When I say that, who am I actually speaking about? I'm talking about the nurses, the psychologists, the counselors, the social workers, the ones who are desperately needed in our schools. And I have a few of the stats up there, but I'm going to read you a few more. So again, ACLU's 2019 Cops to Know Counselors really magnifies the deficits of our school-based mental health providers in the education system. So if we look at what professional recommendations for student to provider ratios are actually out there, we will realize how vastly underserved our students are during a time in their life when they need these resources the most. 21% of US high schools do not have access to a counselor. The only ones, Montana, New Hampshire, and Vermont, are meeting the recommended ratios. Less than 3% of US schools meet the national recommendation of social worker to student ratio, while 67,000 schools report having no social worker capacity at all. That's schools. That is not total student population. 19 million students are not enrolled in a school with a school psychologist. And that's pretty devastating considering of all of the disciplines for school-based mental health providers, a school psychologist has the most knowledge and experience to assess a student's safety status and needs on site. A ratio, and I think this means an average ratio of 1,526 students to one school psychologist, is 200 to 300% above the expert's recommendation. I can't even imagine what that load would be like on a day-to-day basis. For me, being a nurse, knowing that 70% of US schools do not meet the recommendation of a student to nurse ratio of 750 students to one nurse, that's pretty overwhelming. So we can see that these deficits are really glaring contrast to the robust depth and breadth of what SROs are in our public schools. And if you actually go out to the ACLU website, if you visit that, you can find your individual state and see where your state itself stacks up against in those statistics. So if you remember, my title for this presentation is SROs First Do No Harm. So the implication is there are harmful effects having SROs in our schools. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of harm was created as a result of the Columbine shooting because we created a zero tolerance policy. And I think we can all be honest and say we understand why the zero tolerance policy existed. A lot of it was probably fear-based, but we were well researched and were well educated since that point in time in our history. And what has happened with the research that we now know is when we put SROs in our school buildings, there are harmful effects. In fact, in Delaware, if a student is going to school with a law enforcement presence there, they are 8 times more likely to be arrested than if they were in a school with no law enforcement. The federal CRDC data that was analyzed by ACLU notes that students in schools with police were 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than schools without police. And I'm pretty sure I'm talking to an audience that's very savvy about the federal CRDC data, which is voluntary mandatory reporting. So we know that these numbers might not be their full representation. So SROs at schools often lead students to perceive that these environments are actually hostile, and oftentimes students don't want to be there, or they don't want to fully engage in the school environment. So probably one of the saddest statistic to report is in society, our youth have a historic 30 low arrest rate, criminal behavior rate, chemical usage rate. In society, youths are not criminally acting out, being arrested, being entered into the criminal justice system. However, there's a different story that is occurring within our schools. In our schools, we notice that, especially if you are a Black, brown, or disabled or male student, these rates are not similar. We know that these rates are going up. Another article that I had used was from Fisher and Hennessy that reports that school with expulsionary practices tend to have poor school performances. That means that their standardized test scores are actually lower. We know that the Black, brown, and disabled students are targeted at disproportionate rates. And we definitely know that this sets up that school to prison pipeline. And the school to prison pipeline are basically where the schools are referring students simple offenses onward for legal consequences. And the sad part is that once upon a time, administrators or school staff used to address these issues through their own internal policies or procedures. We never used to send them onwards for criminal consequences. So it becomes very concerning because SROs themselves they owe responsibility to both the school administration and the police department. So for them, I'm going to give a little grace because it's got to be really hard to execute their role because it's not really clear or concise without those memorandums of understanding. So if there's not a memorandum of understanding, SROs will always default to do what they're trained to do, which they will address those developmental behaviors or those disability behaviors or a stress response through a punitive consequence. We don't have to look any further than recently out into social media to see these episodes occurring. However, in 2015, the Department of Justice expressed caution that the SRO's interventions are pushing students into this school to prison pipeline. And there are real concerns that the statistical data it's just not complete and it's just not absolute because it is voluntary, which leads to some bias and underreporting. So what has actually been raised as concerns are that students are being charged with things like disorderly conduct when actually they're just talking back to maybe the SRO or maybe an adult teacher. Serious offenses that students are often arrested for or they get referred into the criminal justice system for are physical attacks that occur without a weapon. So, a typical school ground fight, 75% of referrals are for just having a school ground fight. So, oftentimes these criminal charges are deemed excessive and very discriminatory. Again, from ACLU's 2019 Cops and No Counselors report, students with disabilities are arrested 3 times more than their non-disabled peers. Black students are arrested 3 times more than white students. Native Americans, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian students are arrested more than twice that of white students, and Latinx students are arrested 1.3 times more than white students. The reality for American youth is currently with having some of the lowest crime rates in our communities, generational low use of drugs and chemicals. We're just not seeing the same thing happening in our school buildings. And for most of us who are living it, we know that every time, whether it's us as a student or us as a parent with a student, every time that that student, that child is met with aversion, they lose that valuable academic time, they lose developmental progress. And what we are witnessing is that SROs really have no statistical value in preventing school shooting. They actually are noted to have some harmful impact. Not some, they have harmful impact on minorities, on males, on students with disabilities. And they are part of the school to prison pipeline problem that we have in America. So let's talk about the good news. And there is good news. We know that if we have school-based mental health providers, that we can start healing, we can offer some hope to our students. We know that incorporating school-based mental health providers into our educational environments, we create positive outcomes. Whether it's just to the school, whether it generalizes out into our communities, we definitely know what makes an impact to the students themselves. ACLU's 2019 Cops and Counselors identify within that report that incorporating the school-based mental health providers. We improved the school climate. We increased positive health outcomes. We improved school safety. Bet you didn't think that was coming. We actually improve academic achievement scores, and we create students that are career prepared. We actually get students that come to school. We get those attendance rates increasing. We lower suspension rates, we lower expulsion rates, and other disciplinary interventions. Importantly, we improve graduation rates. So as we're getting close to being done, I think everybody's been here where we want to inspire reform. We want to create change. So how do we do that? And why do we want to do that? Well, for us, Victoria and Nikki and I, what we felt very passionate about, very passionate as this came at the end of, I think it was the week that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, which is just a very short car ride from Fargo, North Dakota, is we realized that within the education environment, this is actually the first time for a lot of youth, it's the first time they experienced their first social injustice. And we really wanted to create more protection for students, especially our students here in North Dakota. And we also realized that we need to create better data. We needed more oversight, better data, more oversight. We want more federal standardization happening. We really wanted to see what we could do for a complaint system, especially to ensure that there's more checks and balances that benefit the student and family. And some type of federal definition to the role when it comes to prohibiting criminalization of certain student behaviors. And of course, I've been saying the phrases developmentally appropriate or disability-related behaviors. I myself, as well as the other two moms, we do a lot of local work. I said this to Guy yesterday when we touched base. Unfortunately, sometimes when you're engaging with local elected people, they really don't want to talk to you if you know a little bit about a lot of it. People just kind of avoid talking to you. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is watching how the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018 is going to shape future states, my state, your state. Watch your state to see how this Juvenile Justice Reform Act shapes your state's juvenile justice system. It's supposed to bring all stakeholders together to see how we can realign our youth and not necessarily send them into the justice system for not meeting their needs, whether it's mental health needs, whether it's social services, and whether it's through the school. So I have attempted to talk to some people about the lack of robust school involvement in our juvenile justice bill here in North Dakota. And unfortunately, I did not receive too much of a welcome response to some of my questions. So I'm still working on them. I won't let them dodge me for too much longer. So the last thing I'm going to present to you guys is when my big thing is I can present to you a whole bunch of what is going wrong. I'm also obligated to tell you what I want to have as a solution, or what I call for this issue, our reform wish list. We can always sit and tell what's going on, but we also should be arriving with some solutions too. So for us, what we did is we looked to see what ACLU had suggested in their report. And then we said, oh, this is great, but we actually want more. So what we did is we kind of took their foundation and added to it. And we really, really want parents, advocates, and stakeholders to get really passionate and support the Elementary and Secondary School Counselor Act, which funnels money back into our schools so we can get those school-based mental health providers into our schools to offset that ratio of SROs. We think that's very important. And we also want to remove some federal funding dollars that gives the robust funding to having SROs into our schools. One thing we noticed too is we really believe that there should be a national student to SRO ratio, especially for those that have a higher set of school districts that have more minority students in there that have higher SROs in those school buildings. And we felt that was something that needed to be addressed as well. A lot of implicit bias and inferences we felt went with the SRO ratios. One thing we also would like to see is a little bit more robust and enforcement to student civil rights protection, especially for the Black, brown, and disabled students in our school districts. We're not stopping there. This is mine. I'm not going to lie. I really do believe that we should have a mandated, not a voluntary mandated, but an actual mandated collection system, data collection system that directly ties federal funding to incentivizing compliancy by states. You can be motivated internally or externally, and I just think at this point in time, money seems to be the greater motivation for a lot of states. So let's use it positively to ensure that we're doing right to and for our children. I do believe it's not an issue in North Dakota to enhance and expedite due process rights for students. We don't seem to use due process readily in North Dakota, but it does seem like other states, other parents and guardians use it a little bit more frequently. I think New York actually has a backlog. I might be wrong on the state, but I think New York has a backlog on due process cases. We also really want to mandate and enhance Office of Civil Rights, OCR, role and responsibility to include allegations with SROs. Not sure if that's part of their scope, but we really think it should be. One thing we felt very passionate about is to establish a national standard for SRO qualification and training, and then we just went to town. You can see we asked for a whole bunch of different things to be included with that. Trauma-informed model of care was the first and foremost things, because we already know that most children are entering school already with an ACE, adverse childhood experience. So we already know most kids already have trauma in their backgrounds. We also believe that everybody has forgotten that kids are supposed to act out. This is part of their development. We are supposed to give them grace and guidance. So they should have some child and adolescent development classes. I would hope so. Disability training. I think I get a little frustrated when we keep talking about a hidden disability. I don't believe we should be using that terminology anymore. Autism, anxiety, ADHD, depression, we shouldn't be calling them hidden anymore. We just choose not to talk about them or talk about them freely without that negative connotation. We also believe that SROs should know what IDEA is, what an IEP is, what BIPs are. They also should know how to resolve a conflict without putting hands on a child or cuffs or any of those other aversion interventions. We also think some diversity training, as well as knowing what juvenile justice actually is. Our big thing also was to develop a federal description of what the role and responsibility of an SRO was, including the chain of command and accountability. Are you an employer? Are you an administrator? Or are you a police officer? Remove the federal funds for weaponizing SROs in a public school. I know that one was from the ACLU. Prohibit the use of force based upon age, physical, and disability characteristics of a student. Prohibit the use of prone restraints. Prohibit the use of isolation and seclusion. Those two are not the same. Prohibit mechanical restraints, such as those flex cuffs or handcuffs based upon the age and physical and disability characteristics of a student. Eliminate SROs in elementary schools. I was actually really surprised to know how many elementary schools across the nation employ SROs, and not necessarily as that community representation, but to actually police students. Little kids, 5, 6, 7-year-olds just really should not have the capacity to be criminally charged. They're still in those developmental years of learning what is right and wrong. We felt pretty strong about removing SROs as public school administrators. If you're going to keep them in the schools, then remove their qualified immunity for those acts that they choose to perform in the public school buildings. We would like to see a bilateral complaint system. So the State Education Agency, as well as the Attorney General's office, we want to have a little bit more accountability. And then to limit the SRO's involvement with behaviors, again, that are developmentally appropriate, or the behaviors that are related to a student's disability, which is part of that Stop School Violence Act. So we kind of dreamed big, but we were ready to dream big or go home with our wish list there, Guy.
All right, and I think very important to do so. I'm going to go ahead and remove your screen
Yes.
here if you're all done with your slide presentation, so we can bring you up. And we've had a lot of comments here that have been kind of coming through, and I also want to invite people to ask questions. But first of all, thank you for doing that. I think I know when you wrote the piece for us some time ago about SROs in school. It was a really thoughtful piece and well researched, and really appreciate all your time and energy into this. So let me go here quickly to some of the feedback that we've gotten, and I'm going to bring them up, and I'll read them as we get them. Kaya said, "Can we provide training sessions for by law for all law enforcement to learn about disability and how to handle meltdowns and such?" And of course, there are places that are doing better than others probably here. Yes. Do you have a sense of places that are doing better work, or that are doing better both kind of on the school side, but also in more general? Because we've all seen the tragic stories of individuals who have lost their life due to really people not being educated about disability and handling situations that were, didn't have to end the way they did. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I have many thoughts. I have many thoughts. And you know me well. I'm a research junkie. I'm going out there. I definitely have noticed that it depends on where you're at across the United States. It really is community specific. And that is just how inclusive your community is, and how they respond to all abilities. And I've just grown not to want to say disabilities, because I think it's just what we as a society are willing to provide to enhance abilities. So when I did the presentation for COPA, I got this in the sense that I want to leave you with hope. I want to leave you with hope. I did not get the sense that this was something that a lot of districts were willing to do to have their SROs trained. My sense was it took a lot of advocacy by parents, the want and the need by parents to be there before the willingness, whether it was by the district or the police departments, to proceed forward with training. So I think if you have a really wonderful community that really sees the value in it, you would probably get easy engagement for that idea. I know locally in my area, whether it's on the east side of the state or the west side of the state, we have a lot of providers, mental health providers who are expert in trauma that are more than willing to donate their time. They really want to be involved in creating change and creating awareness of what trauma looks like for whether it's a person with lagging skills or whether it's just a child that has trauma. Because we really want to create a narrative that trauma comes out as an action and not necessarily as a memory. So some people respond traumatic action and not that memory. So aggression or a meltdown or disengaging, which sometimes people will call that they're just being, oppositional, that those are sometimes trauma responses. So we would love to be able to get our local SROs or officers trained. We just need to have that willing collaboration. It might come. We're hoping.
Yeah.
Other communities might have better leadership already there willing to do it.
One of the things that I've kind of learned in this work, whether you're talking about teachers or you're talking about law enforcement, is how a very little bit of knowledge related to trauma in the brain can go such a long way. If you begin to understand what happens to the brain when individuals are traumatized, if you begin to understand what the reaction of an individual that has had a traumatic background might be, when you begin to understand that when a child has a trauma history, that they may be more likely, or anyone has a trauma history, they may be more likely to be hypervigilant. And being hypervigilant, they may be more likely to have stress-related behaviors. And those behaviors, when met with compliance commands, often lead to the escalation. So it's very often the people that should be understanding the child that are escalating the child. And of course, when we're talking about things that happen in schools, it's that escalation that leads to restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, all of these things that are being done then to the child, which further traumatizes the child. And there's so much that's avoidable with even a very basic idea. I mean, for me, as I began to learn more about this and understand that, when someone is having a fight or flight response, that's not a willful reaction. That is a distress reaction. And when they're having that response, they're not communicating with their frontal cortex. They're operating from their amygdala, and understanding, these kinds of reactions, which are perfectly, typical and normal, and people should understand. And especially, again, when we're talking about very young kids, I mean, as you mentioned, in elementary schools, and we see a lot of cases where SROs, that line really blurs with what their role is, and suddenly an SRO is being called in to work with a child who has become escalated. So it seems to me that even a very basic amount of knowledge related to neuroscience. I mean, and again, this is not saying that everybody needs to be a neurologist, but a very basic level of knowledge could go such a far way.
I love that you point that out, because understanding the simple pathways, the very simple pathways of what the flight, fight, response or freeze, right? Because we know
Right.
that there's the freeze response. Thank you, Dr. Mona Delahook, who does a beautiful job in her book of describing this, which is, Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, that we are instinctually set to survive. And that's what our behaviors are based upon, is survival. So, how do we punish a child for who is just doing what their instincts are telling them to do, which is to survive? Unfortunately, what we do as adults harm them, and we inadvertently train them to continue to respond, which creates that very cycle of aversion. Then their stress response gets hypered, are heightened, and then hyper vigilant, and they're always watchful. And we spoke about this yesterday. That's kind of the journey that I'm into within my profession, is really understanding from a very young age how those of us enter this world already at a deficit. And then we have repeated stress that we have not realized that the world just challenges us with. And then we have some lagging skills. And then the systems that we put into play, the education system being primary for kids who have lagging skills, has yet taken the vast amount of information that is out there and has utilized it to enhance what they can do to minimize the stress response that we put on these little bodies and these little minds that are still developing. Instead, it has actually worsened and keeps them in that instinctual survival mode.
Right.
And yeah, education, right?
Yeah. As I told you, I think when we talked yesterday, I'm looking forward to your next research piece, and I know where it's headed. And I think you're really providing a lot of help to people they're going through this. So I look forward to that. Let me get a couple more of the comments here. A couple of folks indicated that they had children that have been arrested by SROs. And of course, how traumatic that has been for them, and their families. So we had a few people that have been through this experience, and again, we need to do better. I mean, it's absolutely absurd that some of these things are happening that are so avoidable. With the right type of training and help and whatnot. And you mentioned, of course. You had the slide about kind of the monkey bars, the prison bars, and I hadn't seen that before. But this idea of the school to prison pipeline, of course, and if you look at the data, I'm pulling up a comment here, but if you look at the data, our prisons, and of course in the United States we have a very we have a lot of people in prison, and a lot of the people that are in prisons are people that are neurodivergent. There are people that are ADHD, autistic. Dyslexia. Our prisons are full of kids that have gone along that school to prison pipeline. And Tara here brings up that many kids of color and neuro kids are treated like criminals from the second and third grade in their school district. And again, overreacting to everything the kids did. And again, sometimes we it seems, I don't want to use the word we here, but it seems like there's an expectation that a 7 or 8 year old is a miniature adult with a fully developed brain. And the truth is that the way that our brains develop, it's a kind of a front to back process. And they don't even have all of these capabilities, yet we put these demands on kids that they're not able to meet. And then, the impulse seems to be towards consequence. Rather than even stopping to think about cause, it's all about consequence.
Yeah.
Let me just go through and just see a few more comments here that we've got. Had a lot of discussion here, and I'm going to get down to the bottom where I've asked people to add some new questions here, and of course, talking about the financial end of things, and money should be geared towards training. Another great point there.
Yes.
Let's take a look here. Yeah, and certainly that report from the ACLU, every time I see that data, I mean, I get knots in my stomach reading about all the schools that we have across the nation that, have police, but don't have don't have counselors, don't have psychologists, don't have so many of the supports that our kids need. And it looks like our friend here, Victoria, was here, and you were talking at the time, I think this comment came up, about the what the MOU might say, what the requirements might be, and she brings up that they only need to be kid friendly. Now that's quite a specific requirement there, right?
And for me, I start asking questions like, what does that mean when you're
Right.
saying it as an adult? Because
Right.
what I think is kid friendly might not be what you think is kid friendly, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like that's a great, what a teacher thinks is kid friendly might not be the same thing as, what a police officer thinks is kid friendly either.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
isn't that a great way to not put anything into,
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. Absolutely is. Here's a comment here from our friend Kat, who says impressive research, and I agree. I know you put a lot
Oh,
into the research that you've done here. And I love this from Rich, who says schools need to change to fit the needs of the child, not the other way around. And unfortunately, that's what we often see, is that
we do.
we're trying to change the child, rather than figuring out what are their needs and accommodating them. Because so much of this comes from, as you said, kids that are not being appropriately accommodated.
That probably is the part that just is the most frustrating. How many years are we past ADA? How many years are we past Section
Mhm.
504 or IDEA? And we're still not getting it right.
Mhm, mhm. Let me ask you a question here that may be a little bit challenging, but um, I've looked at a lot of this data as well, and have a lot of concern about what we've been talking about, the number of schools that are that have law enforcement that don't
Yeah.
have so many other things that kids need. I'm really concerned about kind of the compliance culture of everything getting to be about compliance and consequence. Um, but I've had conversations with lots of different people, and I've heard things like, well, the SROs in our area are different, or oh well, we don't have those issues in our district. And of
Yeah.
course, I hear the same
Yeah.
thing on restraint seclusion. I've had people tell me, oh well, we don't do that in our state, and I'm like, no, you do. You might not be aware, but and there are children. I mean, again, and if you look along the lines of the impact of police in schools, there are children that are more likely to be impacted. There are children that are coming from communities where the the law enforcement presence may be one that strikes fear and other reactions. So again, and I've heard from I remember talking to people who young men that I know, who talked about that he feels that police need to be in schools, and part of
Right.
that probably comes from the fact that people have been traumatized by the school shootings and fear. um, how do you address that? Because I think people are in different places, and like you said, different communities can vary quite a bit. But even if you said in my community this is different, the fact is that in your community, do you still have those same deficits? Are you still missing the pieces? So anyway, I'll stop and let you.
No, I think you have a great question because, you know, my oldest, even though he was ADHD, he was very much a traditional learning student. So he had a really traditional education in Fargo. He was an athlete. He succeeded very well in the classroom. So he enjoyed his relationship with the SRO at the school, and he benefited from his relationship. So it gives me kind of like the double-edged sword for those who benefit. It's a good thing to have the SROs. I am the parent that gets to say I have a child A, but I also have the child B,
Mhm.
because my child B is not going to get the same benefit. So if I have to weigh who's getting the benefit and who's getting the harm, then which one is going to weigh more heavily on me? The one that got the benefit of
Right.
a relationship, or the one who's going to suffer harm and how much harm is going to result. So I kind of think that's kind of where my threshold is in answering that question. What's the return on investment, right? And I think when we see that there are far greater harmful effects than the positive effects of having the SROs in, and I think that's reflective of what we're actually seeing nationally. And I'm not saying that every officer is a replication of what is hitting the headlines. We just know that we have some unilateral issues right now, and that we have been paralyzed as a society, and our oversight agencies are kind of paralyzed in trying to figure out how do we address it that gives everybody benefit, and we don't have marginalized populations suffering disproportionately. And that's what we have, whether they're in the schools or whether they're in the streets. Why do we have it, and why can't we get better collaborations for it to be improved? That's where I'm at. Because it shouldn't be this hard. We should not have kids dying in the schools.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I would say that, one thing to maybe add to that is just, in my very overly simplistic view of the world here, so much of this is about relationship. It's about, someone at the school having a really positive relationship with a kid. And it's that person, whether it's the counselor or the psychologist or the teacher or anyone that has a really positive relationship, can make such a huge difference, for a kid. And, I'm sure that there are, people out in lots of different roles. I mean, we've certainly met school, I think about school administrators that I've met and known that have been that person, and of course there's people that fall way on the opposite side of that, and they are the consequence person. But, I think that that's one of the things that is sacrificed when we don't have the right kinds of professionals in the schools, working with kids, connecting with kids, developing those relationships, and supporting kids that are having difficulty.
I love that you point that out, because I think what we have done is we've fallen away from the relationships, and then having SROs who are trained. I think we need to continue to think SROs are trained specifically to do their jobs on the street. So they are trained in certain methodologies and certain ways to interact. They're not there to build a relationship, right? That's not what their job is for when they're on the street. So when we move them into our schools, they have to work to build a relationship. Now, I have met some SROs that are naturally gifted to have relationship traits. So, but yet they are still trained to take in information really quickly, process it, and then arrive at a determination pretty quick of what they need to do, because that's how they're trained to do it. So I think what has happened is, like, everybody has seen the video of that little 5-year-old boy that was put into the police car, brought back and brought into the school building. And we've seen the two officers have very negative interactions with this little crying 5-year-old boy. I think what disheartens me is that is role modeling. Right. So if we respect officers and we have the halo effect, that's what we call these people of different professions. We give them halo effects. We think what they're doing is something that we as adults then should role model too. Well, if the officer approached this child and had this interaction, then I think that's okay if I do it too. So my own wonderment is, since we've introduced SROs into this school and their training has taken on a different flavor over the years as necessary to address society's issues, we backfeed it into our schools. And then we have administrators and teachers now witnessing this different interaction, because that's how they're trained, is that, I don't want to call it a contaminant, but we're all role modeling behaviors and relationships to each other. Is that part of the issue that we are now experiencing? Because if an officer can treat a kid like that, well, why shouldn't someone else think it's okay to treat a kid like that too?
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. And I like your mention of the halo, because a number of the professions that intersect here are often kind of put in that category.
Yeah, they are. Yep.
Yeah. So we are just about at time here, but I want to bring up a couple
No.
more. I told you
Oh
we'd have fun, you know. So, we have a couple more comments and questions I want to bring up here. One again from Victoria, and she said our state of North Dakota does not like good trouble, but we are not going anywhere anytime soon. And I love that. I love that comment. And I want to encourage you and Victoria have both been on this journey and been making lots of good trouble. And we need more people out there making good trouble.
no.
And, I want to encourage people, whether you're a parent or, whether you're an educator, whatever you might be, if you see things that need to change, that, I mean, we're all just, I mean, regular people that got thrown into this because of our
Yes.
circumstances. I mean, I
Yes.
never planned, a couple of years ago to start an organization to fight for civil rights for kids. It happened because we needed to do something, and I would encourage people to follow the model that you and Victoria put out there as well, and make good trouble. And we're here to try to help with that as well. A couple other comments here. Let's take a look. Let's see. So I haven't read this whole comment, but I'm going to bring it up and we'll kind of go through it. Beth here says it would help if the school staff writing BIPs, behavior intervention plans, had a clue how to
Oh,
write one
yes.
that helped the child instead of punishing them. My son has autism and was leaving the day classroom to get alone. And when he was overwhelmed, which is something that happens, my son at a very early age was an eloper. He was 12. He agreed to stay right outside the classroom, but they felt he was unsafe. And I'll tell you, my son actually hates the word unsafe because he was restrained and secluded for things that were unsafe, which even didn't meet our legal criteria. So, of course, it was seen as an act of defiance. Two things happened. He was chased by the principal until the SRO could be notified. Then he was chased by the SRO, who scared him enough to, it looks like the comment stopped there. But, I think you get the idea. And very often, these behavior plans, first of all, and I don't want to go too far off on a we talked the other day about seeing squirrels, right? And I don't want to get too off on seeing my own squirrel here, but we talk about some of the things that end up in behavior plans, and behavior plans often make the assumption that all behavior is volitional, all behavior is a choice, doesn't take into account the neuroscience, doesn't take into account the polyvagal theory, doesn't take in the fact that not all behavior is volitional. If we're in a fight or flight mode or we're traumatized, we might have behaviors that aren't, but they often meet behaviors with just, it's about rewarding consequence. It's not really helping the child develop the lagging skills. So that's a great point about some of the problems with the BIPs and whatnot. And any thoughts on that?
So I usually write my BIPs for the school. I'm very conscientious of the wording that I use. I have learned a lot from the guests that you have had on, which I'm very grateful for, because I think one of the things that I use is I really push back on the idea that kids are defiant. I use self-advocacy now. They're being self-advocates. They're being their own person. So, and then I like to frame that out in my presented BIP, like this is what it looks like. This is why this is occurring. And, so I'm a nurse and I go way above and beyond because I'm documenting everything, which document everything, right? That's what we all learn about. But I also like to give and this is what I've learned from a lot of OCR interactions too, just don't give wiggle room out. So if there are situations that you want handled in the way that you believe benefits your child the best, then write it out down to the T. Take a lot of language out of those BIPs and IEPs that are very situational based. May, could, if then, because that allows the adult to have a lot of perception of when they're going to apply a physical break, like if your little one needs to go outside. What I have done, and I have encouraged some of the parents that I talk to, if they have issues about SROs, is the SROs are asked to come into IEPs and they're asked to be educated. And then you outline in the IEP or the BIP what the SRO's expectations are, because if they are employed by the school, have their salary paid by the school in any capacity, then they should be considered an employee of the school and should be present at the table. That's what I advise. Now, do we get it? I don't know. It's probably about a 50-50, but you can request it and at least have it documented, right?
So we had another comment here in that vein, and Spectrum Life said, I make support plans, not behavior plans.
I love that, right?
Yeah. That's absolutely great. And, because, let's think about it. We even see districts and schools trying to put things like restraint and seclusion in a behavior intervention plan.
Never.
But of course,
Yes.
these are interventions that are crisis management interventions, shouldn't be a planned intervention. That shows a plan of failure. Yeah. Well, listen, this
support plans.
This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I'm really fortunate that we got the chance to connect some time ago, and I love the research you did on this, and I'm really looking forward to your next research as well. But I really appreciate you spending some time with us today.
No, I appreciate you having me. I appreciate people listening, and I hope it carries good conversations forward among their own circle of individuals. Absolutely enjoyed my time. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And a couple people asked if we might be able to share your slide deck. So let me know if that might be a possibility.
Away.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
I think I have a copy of it, so we can look at sharing it on the page, on the Alliance page. Is there any way that people can get in touch with you if they have questions or are looking for any information?
Is it okay if I give you my email, or you can give out my email?
Sure.
We can make arrangements.
Tell you what, I can make that available. If anybody is looking for it, they can contact me directly. And my email address, I'll put in the chat here, is guystevens@endseclusion.org. So if you would like to be connected, I'd be happy to kind of make that connection as well.
Absolutely. I'm one of those people who will connect with anybody, and I spontaneously connect with people across the United States. So
that's how we connected, right? It was you reached out, and I think that's really important. I think we're both in the same mind that I will talk to anyone who will listen, and they don't need to sit still. They don't need to look at me. If they're interested in what I have to say, we're happy to talk. So I appreciate it. Thanks so much, and I'll look forward to having you again sometime after you get to work on your next bit of research.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to make a couple announcements here, but I will let you go, and thank you.
Thank you.
So a couple quick announcements here. I thank everybody that joined us today. I hope you found this helpful. Really interesting discussion, something that we absolutely need to have more discussion around. And again, those of you that I think somebody said that they were ready to sign up for Good Trouble, I would encourage all of you to think about what you can do, not only to change your local school or school system, but what we can do beyond that. Feel free to email me if you're looking for more information, or if you want to get a copy of the slides. I'll be happy to do that. I'll try to post them up on the site as well. I do want to share with you that we have another great presentation coming up in 2 weeks. So those of you that are aware, every 2 weeks we do these events, and sometimes presentations, sometimes interviews. Really excited. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Greg Santucci. If any of you have been following his work, really amazing occupational therapist who has a Facebook page that he's been really sharing a lot of amazing content on, looking at looking at behavior, looking at many things that are being done that aren't working, but has a great perspective on how to help kids and support kids. And really excited to have Greg on. So thank you again, all of you that joined. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.